Γεια σας φίλοι του Δουρείου Ίππου. Ακολουθεί μια κουβέντα με τον Τζακ Μέρφυ για τα γεγονότα στην Ουκρανία. Ο Τζακ υπηρέτησε για 8 χρόνια στις ένοπλες δυνάμεις των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών, συγκεκριμένα στο 75ο Συνταγμα Ranger και στο 5ο Special Forces Group, με πολλαπλά deployments στο Ιρακ και στο Αφγανιστάν. Είναι κάτοχος πτυχίου πολιτικών επιστημών από το Πανεπιστήμιο Κολούμπια και είναι δημοσιογράφος επιστρατιωτικών θεμάτων. Επίσης παρουσιάζει το δικό του podcast με το όνομα The Team House, το οποίο συστήνω ανεπιφύλακτα. Αν σας αρέσουν τα βίντεο μας και οι συνεντεύξεις που κάνουμε, κάντε like και subscribe. Hello Jack, thank you for being here with us today.
Hey, how's it going, Bill?
All good, all good. I hope Batman was good.
Yeah, it was. We just got back from seeing it like an hour ago. It was really good.
I would like your opinion because I know you're a big Batman fan, so I value your opinion on that.
Yeah, I thought it was probably the better of the Batman films that have been made so far. Yeah. It jumps right into telling a Batman story. Like you would hope the comic books do, rather than, I think all the films really try to retell Batman's origin story, and it's like, you don't really need to tell his origin story or Spider-Man's origin story, because these are like the most well-known fictional characters in the world, certainly in America. So I think you can just jump right into telling a good superhero story with some of these characters. And they did that, and it follows kind of a arc with Batman it picks up where he's been Batman for about 2 years, and he's just out there like punishing criminals, just like brutalizing them. And the story is kind of about, there's a mafia plot line, and there's a serial killer on the loose, a psycho out there. But for Batman, it's also about him realizing that it's not enough for him just to create fear in people, that he has to inspire hope in the people of the city as well. And that he should not just be punishing people, but also helping them. So it was an interesting plot and an interesting story. Even though it is very dark, it maintains that through. I think like the entire movie is shot in the rain and
okay. So at least we don't see his parents dying in an alleyway. So that's a positive. Yeah.
No. But the without giving too much away, the plot does involve his parents. It's about him coming to realize things about his family that he didn't know.
So thanks for that pop culture. That was our little pop culture break. Now to our questions. How do you judge the Special Operation Forces actions and attempts and operations so far in the Ukrainian conflict, in the invasion by Russia?
Yeah, well, I have to caveat all this by saying I take everything coming out of Ukraine with a bit of a grain of salt, right? Because of the nature of war and the fog of war, and also the Russians are naturally going to downplay their losses, and the Ukrainians are going to play it up. So we don't have a lot of authoritative verified data. I mean, people will throw around terms and say this is verified, or until professionals go in and really do assessments on these things after the smoke is cleared, we're not going to know for sure. But because we are in the era of social media, and we are getting news out of Ukraine, I think we can make some initial assessments, right? I think as far as special operations are concerned, this hasn't been a special operations war. It's been largely a conventional war, but with some soft support from both sides. The most visible ones, I think, are VDV, the paratroopers, trying to take some strategic choke points or places like the airfields. And then the Ukrainian special forces, it appears that what they're doing is kind of encircling the enemy, kind of flanking them and firing anti-tank weapons at them. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job at that. The Russians, by comparison, it seems that they're just deploying their special ops guys behind enemy lines and then not appropriately following up with the needed support, right? I mean, special ops are cool. They can do some amazing things, bring some great capabilities to the table. But if you just deploy them behind enemy lines to fight, they are going to get overwhelmed by enemy armor. I mean, it's true of us. It's true of us as Americans too. I mean, you're not going to send a Ranger battalion to go fight a brigade or a division of tanks. Like, it just doesn't work like that, right? That's not how these capabilities are supposed to work. And when you use special operations in a large scale conflict like this, it has to be done in a joint environment, that you're fighting in a joint environment. It's not just SOF, it's not just tanks, it's not just fighter jets. They're all kind of working together in a coordinated strategy towards some sort of end goal. And perhaps that's what the biggest flaw is in this campaign waged by the Russians so far, is that it seems that they're completely unable to plan and execute large, complex, modern military operations. I think that's probably the big takeaway from this right now.
We can say that the conventional nature of the war forces special operation forces to act in a tactical level. As you said, the Ukrainians are hunting supply lines, so that it's not a strategic mission. It's like it's operational at best on the level you can say they expect the result.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think in a conventional war, the role of special operations is often supporting the conventional military. I mean, we even saw this in like World War II, where the OSS or the Jedburghs were kind of paving the way. I mean, it's a critical role that they play, but you're paving the way with intelligence operations or like some rear guard actions to secure key strategic areas before the main body, the main conventional force shows up. So SOF can act as like a force multiplier and complement the conventional military, but SOF is not going to have the lead in a campaign like this, perhaps the way that we've seen during the global war on terror.
It's a question I would like to ask you, because I know you have a thing for intelligence and all that. I am kind of amazed by the social media and the PR campaign and the propaganda campaign, somebody might say, of the Ukrainians. They handling the thing very well. We have seen their presidents, saying lines made out of a World War II movie. Give me ammunition, I don't need a ride. It's something that captivates the audience. Do you think they had cultivated that capability before, or were we watching a very good on-the-fly improvisation?
I mean, that's a great question, and again, I think that the real story will come out in the wash down the line, and we'll learn much more about this. I think a lot of what we're seeing we can chalk up to the Ukrainians having the will to fight. There is quite clearly a national will there. They have a motivation to fight for their country, and they're willing to do that, unlike we've seen in some other parts of the world. Part of it is that Russian incompetence is playing into this, I believe. Part of it is, we could argue that perhaps there is American support behind some of this, that the CIA has taught them how to do black propaganda, or when it comes from the official Ukrainian government, we're not talking about black propaganda. That's just PR, public relations, messaging, signaling. So maybe we've helped them with some of that. With Zelensky, I mean, it's interesting because he was a comedian, he was an actor. So maybe this is really playing into his strong suits, right? Like maybe this is the role he was born to play, is the tough, inspirational president that's under siege. And I don't say that to demean him in any way, because I mean, whether you like him or not, he has shown a backbone and has stood his ground and seems like he's ready to go down with the ship. But as far as how, like you said, he sounds like these lines out of a World War II movie. I mean, maybe this is just really his moment to shine, because he's somebody who understands how to communicate with the wider public.
Let's not forget a lot of, great leaders. I'm not chucking Zelensky up there yet, because some people will say, oh, not yet. I'm just saying a lot of great leaders used theatricality for their own benefit. Patton is one. He was...
Yeah, Ronald Reagan was an actor before he was president, and I mean, he had that moment: bring down this wall, tear down this war, Mr. Gorbachev.
Yeah, he was delivering. You grew up in a country watching Red Dawn, and all those movies about the might of the Russian army. And I guess a lot of things in the United States Army are focused to deal with such large armies, even the PLA or the Russian army. So how Americans, and I guess Americans, I'm talking about you and other people in the business and in the industry of defense, how they judging the performance of the Russian army so far? And what's the key points they notice that, it's good or bad?
Well, I can't speak for, the Pentagon or the larger defense industry in America, but I think that anyone, you don't even have to be necessarily a military expert to assess that the Russians are really getting their ass kicked here. And I mean, it's beyond just propaganda. Like I said, the Ukrainians are clearly going to play this up. But even beyond any sort of propaganda, I mean, the Russians are getting hammered out there. And it calls into question a lot of the assumptions that we have made. I mean, going back 80 years. I mean, it depends how far back you want to go and how uncomfortable we're prepared to get to ask ourselves some real questions about Russian military capabilities and if we have not been over assessing their competency for, the better part of 80 years here. Um, I think maybe it's a little too soon to say that. And we'll see what happens in the coming weeks in Ukraine. But I mean, as you said, we all grew up in America. I mean, we've had these cultural moments in this sort of, I guess you could say, Cold War zeitgeist that about the Russian bear. And as a former soldier myself, these opinions that we all hold in our minds of the Russians that they're brutal, they're ruthless, nothing can stop them. They'll just bring in their artillery and their barrel bombs, and they'll just level cities to the ground. They don't care about human rights. They'll just steamroll anything in their path. And they've solidified that relationship or that reputation in places like Grozny. Chechnya was a hard fought campaign. It's not like they did so well there either. And then in Syria, where they had a wanton disregard for civilian casualties and had no problem flattening cities. And then we've seen them, where they were unwilling to take casualties in places like Syria, they'd bring in mercenaries that are somewhat more deniable and expendable. Um, but now we're suddenly having to reassess. I think the Pentagon and I think all of us are having to reassess how we see Russia and how credible a threat they are, or ever were. We're watching what's happening in Ukraine now. Can you imagine if they attacked an actual NATO member and it triggered an Article 5 and now the Russians had to face the combined weight of NATO militaries, all these European militaries plus America? I mean, they would absolutely get crushed. I mean, there's no getting away from that assessment at this point because we're kind of seeing where the rubber meets the asphalt, so to speak, in Ukraine. It's impossible to believe that if they attacked Estonia or they attacked Poland, that somehow they're going to magically become more competent overnight. I mean, we were told that the Russian military went through a modernization process over what, the last 10, 15 years? I mean, clearly that has not paid off the dividends that they would have liked us to thought. And going back to what I said initially, I think the big takeaway is that this military is just unable to plan and execute large, complex, modern military operations. They seem to have a profound inability to
Do
do
you
that.
think that morale plays a role in that? Because as we know, the two countries have close cultural relationships, even though the Ukrainians clearly they don't want to be part of Russia. But there is a close cultural and personal in sometimes. People have friends on both sides. Do you think that plays into the inhibition of the Russian soldiers to act more aggressively, or up to a point?
I have to believe that that does play a pretty big role up to a certain point. I mean, morale or will is not going to win you the war in of itself. A people can have tremendous will and tremendous morale, and willingness to fight, but if if they belong to a military that is, I mean, there's just a certain calculus to it. I mean, if they have more guns and more tanks and more airplanes than you do, then your morale doesn't necessarily count for much. And I mean, this morale, like we saw in Afghanistan, the Afghan special operations guys, they had a will to fight. In Iraq too, when they were fighting ISIS initially, I mean, the guys I knew had a will to fight, but if your military and your government is not delivering to you more bullets and food and water, then that will is only going to get you so far, right? But the morale, the willingness to fight to the last bullet, I mean, it does count for something. And the Ukrainians seem pretty willing to fight, to the last bullet or the second to last bullet. I mean, they seem pretty dedicated. Whereas from what we've seen so far from some of the POWs that have been captured on the Russian side, I mean, it ranges from 19-year-old conscripts who are like, where am I? What am I doing here? What's going on? We didn't think we were ever going to cross the border. We were lied to some of the other POWs that have been captured, outright saying derogatory things about their chain of command, saying that they were lied to. So, yeah, I mean, some of the things we're seeing where main battle tanks are just being abandoned in the streets, I mean, that's not something that like you would ever see American troops do. Um, there's some things we're not good at. We're not good at counterinsurgencies, but I mean, you're not going to see us like run out of gas or just abandon our vehicles because we don't have the will to fight anymore. Like that doesn't really happen. So that I think that does speak to a lack of morale or a will to fight on the Russian side. And like, what percentage does that play into the overall campaign of like who's going to win? I don't know. I have a hard time assessing that, but I have to think that it does matter.
I think the surprise here is like at the beginning of this conflict, I think also you have done that bet. No, that's a bet about the invasion. Sorry. Most people were assuming that this was gonna end in 2 days. Now I see reports and analysis about how even the Ukrainians can win that, which is insane if you ask my opinion.
Yeah.
But still, so is the Ukrainians that good or the Russians that bad if that happens?
Maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe the Ukrainians really did improve over what it was the 8 years that NATO was in there training them. I've spoken to people who say that we did make, and the Ukrainians made large strides in modernizing their military, whereas maybe the Russians did not make those strides as much as we thought they had over the last 10 years. So, I mean, yeah, it's hard to say, but I think you're right that it is surprising and wild. And I was one of those people. I didn't think Putin was crazy enough to invade. And then when he did, I thought, well, again, just because of the way the numbers stack up, I figured the Russians are going to crush the Ukrainian army in 48, 72 hours, and this thing's going to be over, right? Here we are over a week later, and the Russians still have not gained air superiority. It's uncanny, and it's completely surprising and shocking. And this is nothing less than history happening before our eyes. And I think we all have to take a step back and reassess some of our previously held positions.
Why do you think the Russian Air Force has that bad of a result?
Yeah, I don't have a real good answer to that question. I don't think anyone has a really good answer to that question as of yet. But I'm as baffled as anyone else. I think RUSI, the British think tank, has put out a couple interesting articles about this subject. Initially speculating that they were not prepared for a large-scale air campaign, or that there was a lack of precision-guided munitions, or that their pilots were not briefed up correctly. I mean, there are all sorts of weird explanations. The latest one is just that, again, we're having to reassess Russian military capabilities. That when the Russians would fly sorties in Syria, they never flew. Usually the fighter jets flew in pairs, sometimes as fours, but never anything more than that. And we're having to consider that perhaps the Russians are unable to plan and execute large, complex air campaigns the way that the United States has done in Iraq, and I mean, really all around the world. We just deploy incredibly complex air maneuvers. And it seems that the Russians are not able to get their act together and do that. Now, if over the next week suddenly that changes and they start conducting some large scale air campaign over Ukraine, maybe again we'll have to reassess this again. But at the moment, I mean, it looks like they're just unable to conduct these types of operations, and I mean that brings up all sorts of questions.
Well, Jack, thank you very much for your time. Your answers were very informative. And again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Anytime, man.
Have a good evening.
You too.